So, welcome back to the second episode of creating a toggle navigation using JavaScript. Now, in the previous episode, we spent a lot of time setting up the HTML and CSS markup and styling in order to prepare our website for this toggle navigation we're going to create using JavaScript. So, as you can see in front of me here, I do have the project from the previous episode. And what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to add the JavaScript to our website so we can get this sliding open and close effect when it comes to the site navigation. So, what we need to do starting out with is we're going to go down to the bottom and link to our main.js file, which is going to be the JavaScript file we're going to write all the JavaScript code inside of. So at the bottom here, right after the body tag or the ending of the body tag, I'm going to go ahead and link to my main.js file. So I'm going to write a script tag and say I want the source to be main.js, since that is the name of my JavaScript file. Now, do note that you don't have to call it main.js. That is a habit that some programmers like to do. Other people like to call it script.js instead. So there's a lot of options here when it comes to naming your JavaScript file. The only reason I call this one main.js is because this is going to be a main JavaScript file that's going to run in this project here. Typically, you do have multiple JavaScript files, some for some pages, some for other pages, some for specific functions. But just know that we're just going to have one main file for this episode here. After linking to the JavaScript file, we need to go into the JavaScript file and start creating the JavaScript code. JavaScript. That will actually go ahead and run this sliding when we want to click the button at the top of the website. By the way, let's actually go ahead and take a look at the website since we haven't seen it since the last episode. Right now, this is what we have from the previous episode. If I were to click this button up here, you can see nothing happens inside the website. What we want to happen is if we were to go back to the finished version of the website, as you can see, it starts opening and closing, which is the effect we want to create using JavaScript. So what that means is that we're going to manipulate a lot of CSS styling using JavaScript, which is a feature of JavaScript that is used quite often. So inside the main.js file, I am going to go ahead and start out by creating the code that will actually check if we have the navigation open or closed, since that is something we need to know in order to know if we need to open it or if we need to close it. Now, I do want to mention first, before we write any JavaScript, that there is a lot of ways to create the same feature inside a website. The way that I'm creating it in this episode is just one of 100 different ways you could do it. So if you have another solution for it, then go ahead and test it out and try it out and see if it works. If it does work, then good for you. You got a new method. So I can only applaud that because JavaScript is about finding solutions to a problem. Again, JavaScript is a little bit different than HTML and CSS because you need to think of it in a slightly different way. It's more mathematical than HTML and CSS is, because HTML is just about seeing, well, we have this sort of content, so we need to wrap it around these sort of tags. Whereas JavaScript is, you have this problem and you need to solve it using some kind of solution. So there's a lot of different solutions for it. So what we're going to start out with is we're going to go ahead and check if the navigation is open or closed, because that is important for the code to know in order to know what to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a let type variable, which we talked about in a previous episode. If you don't know what a let variable is, then go ahead and check out my let var and const episode a few episodes ago. We're going to go ahead and create a let variable called toggle nav status, just so you know what exactly the status is. And I'm going to set this equal to a boolean, which means a true or false statement. So right now the navigation is closed as a default, so we want to set this one to false. Or if it makes sense for you, then you can set it to true. Doesn't really matter, we can do whatever we want, but in this example here, I'm going to set it to false. Afterwards, I want to create the function that does actually open and close the menu once we click the toggle nav button. So I'm going to create an anonymous function in order to not hoist anything inside the browser. Now, this variable up here will actually get hoisted because it's inside the global scope, but it's so tiny that I don't think it's going to matter much in this episode. So we're just going to go ahead and create an anonymous function. So I'm going to say let, and we're going to go ahead and say toggle nav. And again, you can call whatever you want. I'm going to set this one equal to a anonymous function. So we're going to say function, parentheses, curly brackets. Then inside the function here, the first thing I want to do is I want to grab all the different content that we want to use in order to get this working. So what we want to do is we want to manipulate CSS. So we need to grab the elements that we need to change the CSS of inside the website here. So if we were to go back to our index.html, just to take a look at it, So if I remember correctly, I do think the nav sidebar had a width set to 50 pixels inside my CSS styling. So what we want to do is when I do actually click the button to open up the navigation, I want to change the width of the sidebar to something that does actually fit all the content we have down here inside the sidebar. So we're going to grab the navigation or the sidebar, and then we're going to tell it using JavaScript to change the CSS styling so we have a broader width inside the sidebar. So inside the main.js file, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say we have a variable or a let variable that I want to call get sidebar. Now, just FYI, when we grab something in any sort of programming language, we usually use the keyword get in front of the name so we know what we're talking about. And if you want to change something, we call it set something. And this is not something you have to do. This is just something that is a habit of programmers to do. So just FYI. So afterwards, we want to set it equal to the actual HTML element we have inside the index page. Now, the way we grab that is not something we have actually had a lesson on in this course here, but it's something we will have a lesson on soon when we do get to talk about how to manipulate content inside a website. So we're sort of learning something prematurely here. Now, when I want to grab something inside my index file, right now my main.js file is part of the index file because I linked to it down here at the bottom, meaning that if I want to change something inside this document here, I can refer to this document. So inside my, right after the equal sign, I can say we have a document, which is the index.html page because we linked to it. Punctuation, and then I want to do something inside this document. What I want to do is I want to use a JavaScript method called query selector, which is a method we can use in order to grab HTML items from inside our website and all the content in between the HTML tags, of course. So what I want to do is in between the parentheses, I want to say double quotes, and then I want to write what we want to grab. Right now, we want to get the sidebar, and I do believe it was called class nav-sidebar. Let's actually double check that to make sure we don't get errors. Yes, that's what we call it. Now, do notice that inside the parentheses, we refer to classes with punctuations, and IDs are going to be hashtags. So it's sort of the same as inside CSS styling. So the next thing we want to grab, we can actually just go ahead and copy paste this because we're going to do something similar. The next thing we're going to grab is going to be the actual unordered list inside the sidebar. Because right now the unordered list inside the CSS file is hidden. We can actually go ahead and go down and check for that just to show you. So right now you can see the visibility is set to hidden because we don't want to see the content when we haven't clicked the button yet. So it's hidden inside the browser. So what I want to do is I want to actually activate it. So I want to grab the UL and change that CSS styling. So we're going to grab the get sidebar UL for unordered lists. Again, that's just the way I decided to name it. And then I want to grab something from inside the index page, and I want to grab the nav sidebar space UL. So in the same way as inside CSS styling, you can also create a path. So you can say the unordered list inside the sidebar, if that makes sense. So we're going to go ahead and grab the next item here. And again, there's just a few CSS things we need to change from inside the styling. The next thing I want to change is going to be the title inside my, inside the sidebar. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the title. And I'm going to go ahead and set this one to sidebar span. Because inside the index page, we decide to wrap our title inside span tags and the rest of the content down here inside anchor tags because they're links, of course. So the next thing we need to do is we need to grab the links inside the sidebar. So we're going to go ahead and copy paste. If I can actually see my keyboard, it's hidden behind the microphone. And we're going to go ahead and change it from title to just A, I guess. We can also call it links. That might make more sense. And I'm going to go ahead and change the path in here to an anchor tag. Now, right now we do actually have a problem here because the query selector that we used only selects one element from inside the website. Meaning that if we were to take a look at the index page, you can see that we have many different anchor tags inside the website here. But it's only going to select one, which means that it's only going to grab the first one in here. So how do we get all the anchor tags and group them together inside a variable? Well, the way we do that is by using something called query selector all. And what Selector All does is that it grabs all the instances of this specific path that we wrote in here, which means that we have all the anchor tags inside the sidebar, and it takes all of them and puts them inside an array for us to use later. Now, if you don't know what an array is, I do recommend you go back and check out my array episode, since arrays are pretty important when it comes to JavaScript and we do use them all the time. So do go check that one out if you're a little bit confused about arrays. Now, I will also link it in the description, of course, just so you have it somewhere. So now that we have this, the next thing we need to do is we need to actually do something to the CSS styling depending on this variable we have up here. So I'm going to go down to the next line, just a couple ones down, so we can actually separate our code a little bit. And I'm going to create an if statement. Now, this if statement is going to check if the toggle nav status is equal to false or equal to true. So I'm going to grab it here. And I'm going to check, is it equal to false, then do what is inside the curly brackets here. So before we change any CSS using JavaScript, I do want to sort of think about what I want to change first inside the website. Because remember, a JavaScript document gets read from top to bottom inside the browser. So we need to think about what I want to change first inside the CSS styling. And again, in this specific example here, it's not really going to matter. But in some examples or some projects, it might matter the way that you read certain JavaScript code. So do think about this before you just start typing in JavaScript code inside something like a function here. Now, my example here, the first thing I want to change is going to be the unordered list inside the sidebar. And again, you can do in whatever order you want to. I just think that it's better to actually show the content before we actually start sliding the width and that sort of thing. So I'm going to grab the sidebar from up here that does actually refer to the actual sidebar from inside the HTML document. And using a style property that is built into JavaScript, I'm going to tell it that I want to change a certain styling inside the style sheet. So I'm going to say we have a style property by saying dot style. In the same way as if we were to take the length of a certain string, we would use dot length. We're going to use dot style. And I want to say dot and then the property inside the style sheet that I want to change. So in this example here, I want to change the visibility because right now it's set to hidden. So I want to change the visibility and set it equal to double quotes, semicolon, and I want to set it equal to visible. Which means that now if I were to actually click something inside the browser, or click something, if I were to click the button inside the browser, then it does actually show the sidebar inside, or the content inside the sidebar. Now, before we do the next thing, we do need to change something inside the style sheet that we forgot to do in the previous episode, which is to set the opacity of the title and the links to 0, because I want them to be invisible and then fade to visible when we do actually open the sidebar. So inside the style sheet down at the bottom, I do want to change the span and the links to having a opacity set to 0. So I want to say opacity set to 0. There we go. And now, if we were to go back into the main.js file, we can go down to the next line and refer to the title and say we want to style it. I want to style the opacity and I want to set it equal to 1. Actually not 1, because the title is going to be slightly transparent, at least I think so, because it looks nicer. So I'm going to change it to 0.5. There we go. Now, the next part is going to be a little bit more difficult because the title and the UL and the sidebar are just one HTML item we grab from inside the index page. Now, the links is inside an array because remember we used a query selector all to put them inside an array, and we could actually console log this inside the browser just to see what exactly happens in order to see that we have everything inside an array. So the way we need to do this in order to change the styling is we're going to go ahead and run a loop. Now, we haven't actually talked about loops yet in this course here, so just to make it simple, a loop is a way for us to loop the same JavaScript code over and over again. And in this example here, what I want to do is I want to take an array, which is the one we have all the links inside of it, and I want to loop through the array and do something to each index inside the array, which means each link we have inside the array, which means I want to change the CSS styling of each link we have inside the array, if that makes sense. So I think the best way to sort of explain the loop is just by creating one and then explaining as I'm creating it. So on the next line here, I'm going to first of all create a variable that is going to be a let variable that is going to tell us how many times do we want to run the loop inside the code. So I'm going to say array length, because what we want to do is we want to run the loop just as many times as we have indexes inside our array, which means that whatever number of links we have inside the array, if that makes sense. So I'm going to set it equal to, and then I'm going to grab the get sidebar links dot length, because remember when we have an array, again from the array episode, when we have an array and we use the dot length property, then we get the number of indexes that we have inside the array. So this is how we get the number here. Afterwards, I want to create a for loop. Now a for loop right now, it might seem very confusing because I just created a standard loop really quickly. We're saying that we have a for loop. Inside the parentheses, we have 3 pieces of information. First of all, we have a variable, which we're going to go and change to let, because we don't want to use variable, which is going to be a starting number of the loop. So right now we have 0 as our starting number, and each time we run the loop, it's going to increase 1, which means that the next time it's going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, then it's going to be 3, and when we get to a certain number, I want it to stop looping. So right now we start at 0, and then I want to say we want to run it until we have I, which is the variable here that's equal to 0. Once I hits a certain number, it needs to stop looping. So I want to stop it once we reach the same number of indexes as we have inside the array. So it's not going to loop more times than we have links inside the array. So it's going to stop once I is smaller than the array length. And each time we run the loop, we want it to increase by 1. Which is what we use here with the I++ icon. And again, we also talked about I++ in the previous episode. So this is what happens inside a loop. So inside the loop here, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and grab the sidebar links again. And what I want to do is I want to say, well, we want to grab the first array index inside the array, which is going to be the first link, and change the CSS styling of it. So I want to grab the first index, and again, this shouldn't be new because this is just how we grab an index from inside an array, again from the array episode. I want to grab I, because right now I is equal to 0, which means that we're grabbing the 0 index inside the array, which is the first index. Because remember, inside programming, we don't start at 1, we always start at 0. So the first index inside the array is going to be 0. So I is equal to 0, which means that the first time we loop, we're going to grab the first index. Then the next time we loop, I is going to change to 1, because remember I said that it's going to increase by 1 each time, which means that automatically in the next loop, we're going to grab the next index inside the array. That's a kind of cool way of doing it. So inside of here, I want to grab the style property, which means I'm going to do something to the first link inside the CSS file. Then I want to change something. I want to change the opacity, and I want to set it equal to 1. There we go. And that is basically all we need to do here with the loop. That's it. So I hope it didn't confuse you too much when we talked about loops. So on the next line here, the next thing I want to do as the final thing inside this if statement is I want to change my toggle nav status, which we have up here, to true. Because I don't want it to run the same if statement again if we were to click the button. So it needs to change to true. And then we're going to create a second if else statement that is going to run basically the same code, but in a different order. So I'm going to say we want to change the nav status or toggle nav status and set it equal to true. We're not going to check if it's equal to, we're actually going to set it equal to, otherwise we're going to get an error. And there we go. Now, before we create the if-else statement, I do want to test out if this function actually works inside the browser. So before we actually go into the browser and run it, what I want to do is I want to go inside the index page, because right now we don't actually run the function once we click the button, and we need to change that inside the index page. So inside our button that we have up here, which is called button toggle nav, I'm going to go ahead and create an attribute that's going to be called onClick. Now, onClick is a built-in JavaScript attribute inside the browser. So if you use the onClick name inside as an attribute, it's going to mean that when you click this item, something is going to happen. And what I want to happen is I want to run the JavaScript function we created inside the main.js file. So we grab the function name, or in this case, the anonymous function, which is called toggle nav. And I'm going to go ahead and refer to it inside my onClick event here. Again, we're going to go and talk about events a lot more in the future, but for now, just know that this is a onClick event, which means that when the user interacts with the website in a certain way, then we do something using JavaScript. So we're going to run this function when the user clicks the button. So now I can actually go inside my website, refresh it, and if I were to click the button, you can see that we now open up the menu. It didn't slide open like the other example, but we're going to go and fix that once we're done with the actual function. But as you can see, it does actually work. If we were to click the button again, you can see nothing happens. And that's because we need to create the if-else statement that will do the opposite in order to close it back down again. So inside our main.js file, we're going to go and copy the if statement, and we're going to go and paste it below here. Then I'm going to go and change it to a if-else statement. And what we want to do in here is we want to first of all not check if the toggle nav status is false, but we need to check if it's true inside the function here. And what we want to do at the bottom here is I want to change it to false once we're done running this specific if-else statement. So the first time we run the function inside the website is going to go through the function and check if toggle nav status is equal to false or if it's equal to true. And if it's equal to false, then it's going to run the first if statement. And if it's equal to true, then it's going to run the second if-else statement down here. And then it's going to just switch around, alternating between the two each time we click the button. So inside the if-else statement, we're going to change a couple of things because we first of all want to set our style for the width to 50 pixels because that was the default styling inside our CSS file. So we're basically just changing everything back to the default styling. And I do also want to change the visibility, not up here. Again, that's just a choice that I decided to not do inside my code. And I want to do it down at the bottom instead, right before we do actually change the toggle nav status, because that's the order I think is better for this example here. We're also going to go and change the opacity for the title, so we're going to set it to 0. And the same thing goes for the navigation links down here. We're going to set them to 0, and the visibility is going to be hidden. And we do need to change one more thing, because I just noticed that I switched around on the if-else statement here, so we're going to change them to else if. And then we're going to go and go inside the browser, refresh it. Then when we click the button, you can see it opens up. Then when I click it again, it's going to close back down again. So now we do actually have a toggle navigation working, but the navigation is not really animated yet. We want it to slide open and fade in and then fade back out again. And we do that using pure CSS. So we don't actually need to do that using JavaScript. So inside the CSS file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the bottom here. And the different elements that we grabbed using JavaScript, we're going to add a transition to them. So where we have the sidebar, which is the first one, I'm going to say we have a transition. Inside the transition, I'm going to say we want to animate everything. So we're going to say all. Then I want to set it to something like 0.3 seconds, which is 300 milliseconds in duration. And I want to say I want to ease in and out. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy what I have here. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it down to the other styling. So the UL we have here is just going to be, well, we don't actually need to do anything to this one because it's not going to transition. But the links down here and the title is going to transition. So now that we added all the transitions to the CSS styling, we can actually go inside the browser and test it out. So inside the browser, if we were to refresh and click the button, you can see it fades in and slides out. If we were to click it again, you can see it does the exact same thing the other way around. So now we do actually have a toggle navigation working inside our browser here. So I hope you had a lot of fun creating this project with me, since I know that JavaScript can be a little bit tough to swallow, especially coming directly from HTML and CSS, since it's a slightly different mindset you need to have when you want to create JavaScript code compared to HTML markup. But I hope this project could sort of enlighten you in seeing how we could actually use JavaScript inside a website and how we can use it to manipulate the content inside a website. Now, in the next couple episodes, we're going to talk about something called objects inside JavaScript, which is something used quite often when we do JavaScript inside our websites, since JavaScript is actually what we call an object-oriented programming language, even though coming from another language that is also object-oriented. You might think that JavaScript is a little bit sloppy when it comes to the way we use it, but never mind that. We're just going to go ahead and talk about how JavaScript can be used as an object-oriented programming language in the next couple of lessons. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next episode.